Welcome to Learning Principle 2. What is extinction? In this presentation, we're going to define extinction for you and talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions. We'll explain how to use this procedure and talk about some notes on extinction. And we'll review the advantages and disadvantages of extinction. Finally, we'll give you some examples so that you can understand everything we've talked about. Now remember what we talked about in our first learning principle about positive reinforcement? How do we increase behavior? We use positive reinforcement to increase behavior, right? So when a behavior occurs that we want to increase, we provide a reinforcer immediately after that behavior, and the result is an increase in that behavior. Extinction is a procedure that's used to decrease a behavior. According to Fox, extinction is the most widely used procedure for decreasing behaviors. One of the advantages is that it can be effectively used in a variety of settings and with a variety of behaviors, and it's relatively simple. You simply withhold the reinforcer. Let's define extinction. If in a given situation an individual emits a previously reinforced response, and that response is no longer followed by a reinforcing consequence, then that person is less likely to do the same thing again when he or she encounters a similar situation. So the principle of extinction involves a procedure and a result. You have a behavior that occurs. Right after the behavior occurs, we no longer provide that reinforcer, and the result is that you should see a decrease in behavior. So for example, let's say that a child has been screaming in order to get a glass of juice. And for the past couple of weeks, every time they scream, we give them juice. What we've done here is we've actually reinforced the behavior of screaming. So we've increased the screaming because right after the screaming occurs, we provide them with the juice. Now what we want to do is decrease the screaming. So we might use extinction, where right after the behavior of screaming occurs, we no longer provide the juice. Eventually what you should see is a decrease in screaming. We'll talk later about what to do instead of the screaming, because what's important is to teach an alternative behavior. So if the child wants juice, we just need to teach them a more appropriate way of getting it. So procedurally, if a response has been increased in frequency through positive reinforcement, then if we cease to reinforce the response, we should see a decrease in frequency. Now the success of this procedure depends on a couple of things. In order for us to be able to withhold the reinforcer, we need to know what the reinforcer is, right? Remember in the example I just gave, we knew that juice was the reinforcer. But if you don't know why the child is screaming, you're not going to be able to do extinction. You need to identify the reinforcing consequence first. We'll talk about how to do that a little bit later. The other thing that's crucial to the success of an extinction procedure is consistent application. This means that we have to apply our extinction procedure every time the challenging behavior occurs, and we need everyone on board. So everybody who's working with the child needs to be following the same procedure. Otherwise, the child might learn that they can't scream with some people, but they can still get away with it with others. Remember, be consistent. Let's review. Now, extinction is basically withholding the reinforcer that's responsible for the behavior. Pretty simple. Don't reinforce. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean ignoring the child. Oftentimes, people define extinction as simply ignoring the behavior or ignoring the child. This is not the case. Now, there are times where an extinction procedure could involve planned ignoring of the behavior, meaning after a behavior occurs, we don't provide any verbal or physical attention. But this is only going to be effective if attention was the reinforcer. If the child was engaging in screaming in order to get attention, and then we don't provide them with any verbal or physical attention, this could be an effective extinction procedure. However, if the child is engaging in screaming because they're trying to get an item, they still get the item but we don't give them any verbal or physical attention, this is not an example of extinction because they're still getting the reinforcer, the item that they're trying to get. So remember, although sometimes planned ignoring may be part of an extinction procedure, it's not always the case and shouldn't be given as the definition of extinction. So how do you start? As we've discussed, in order to withhold the reinforcing consequence, you need to know what the reinforcer is, right? In order to do that, oftentimes, we'll conduct a functional assessment. This helps us determine the function of the behavior in question. The function is sort of the why of the behavior. Why is the behavior occurring? What is the child getting out of the behavior? Usually, behaviors are going to occur because of one of the following reasons. A, maybe something is being removed right after the behavior occurs, like a demand, a task, or an unpleasant stimuli. So for example, you have a child who is engaging in some tantrum behavior in the classroom because when he does throw a tantrum, he doesn't have to write the spelling test anymore. In this situation, the challenging behavior, the tantrum, is occurring because we remove a demand. We take away the spelling test when the tantrum occurs. B, the other reason behaviors could be occurring is that something is being provided after the behavior occurs. So, after a tantrum occurs, maybe we're providing lots of attention, or that's when we present a preferred item. So for example, you have a child who engages in some hitting or some self-injurious behavior, and that's when they get a lot of attention from a teacher or from a parent, or that's when they get that really highly reinforcing toy that they like. So here are the big functions of behavior. A child could be engaging in some challenging behavior in order to access attention, access tangible items, escape or avoid demands, or automatic reinforcement. So the sensation that they may be getting, or maybe they're doing it to sort of get rid of some pain. Think of scratching. If you're really itchy and you scratch it, the pain goes away. Let's review our principle one more time just to make sure we understand. The principle of extinction involves a procedure and a result. So right after the behavior occurs, we no longer provide the reinforcer, and we should see a decrease in behavior. Now, one of the things that sometimes happens is that it may get worse before it gets better. So if we look at this example, during our baseline is pre-intervention. So before we started the extinction procedure, our behavior was maybe happening 10 times a day or so. Now we put in the extinction procedure after we figured out what our function was. We might see a spike here. So what we see is an increase in behavior, but then a couple of days later, we see a gradual decrease to 0 behaviors. What's important here is you have to stick with it. If we erroneously conclude that the extinction procedure isn't working, we could end up reinforcing even a worse form of the behavior. So if, let's say on day 9, we decided extinction isn't working, we're going to stop doing it, the child is engaging in that challenging behavior way more often. And so we actually may be seeing the behavior get worse. So this is why stick with it and you should see a gradual decrease. I just talked about the extinction burst. So as mentioned, this is where the behavior might actually increase in frequency, intensity, or severity initially before it begins to decrease. This doesn't happen all the time, but it is a possibility. The other thing that you may come across is something called spontaneous recovery. This is where the target behavior may reappear after it's been reduced. This is usually short-lived, so usually continuing on with the extinction procedure usually causes the behavior to decrease back down right away. A couple of notes on extinction. When a behavior no longer occurs because of several applications of the extinction procedure, we see that the behavior has been extinguished. Now, this may take time. It could take several trials, several days, or even longer. We need to consider how long the behavior was being reinforced before we put in our procedure. Now, there should be a gradual decrease in the behavior, and how long the procedure will need to be in place depends on a few different things. I just talked about how long the behavior has been reinforced. So this refers to the history of reinforcement. How often has the child, or how long has the child been reinforced for this behavior before we decided to no longer provide the reinforcer? If a child has been screaming for juice, for example, for only a day or two, it probably won't take too long for the extinction procedure to be effective. However, if the child has a long history of screaming for juice, so they have been screaming for juice for several months or even longer, it's going to take a little bit of time before the extinction procedure is effective. The other thing you need to consider is whether extinction has been attempted before, the student's deprivation level, so how motivated are they to get that reinforcer, and the response effort for the target behavior. When we talk about response effort, we're looking at how hard is it for the child to access that reinforcer. So if you have a child who is currently screaming in order to get a reinforcer, screaming could be potentially a pretty easy response. They scream and then they get the juice right away. Let's say that we're trying to teach the child now that they're only going to get the juice if they ask appropriately using a picture. That may take a little bit more effort on the part of the child. So in order to get juice, they have to find their communication book, get the picture of the juice, bring it to mom or dad or a caregiver in order for them to get the juice. So it could be a little bit harder. What's important here again is that asking with a picture is way more appropriate and functional than screaming. So it is worth teaching that behavior. But you want to make that alternative response easy enough so that the child will engage in it. Some advantages of using extinction are that it's a widely used procedure, it's pretty effective, and it usually has long-lasting effects. It's relatively non-aversive and pretty simple to do. Again, it can be used in a variety of settings, and it's very powerful when we use it in combination with reinforcement. Remember, I just talked about increasing an alternative behavior? You want to make sure that if you're decreasing a challenging behavior, what's a more appropriate functional behavior that you can increase and reinforce? In the last example I gave, we're using extinction with the screaming for juice, but we're going to reinforce asking for juice with a picture. Some of the things you may consider in terms of some potential disadvantages: there may be a short burst, and it could take a while before the behavior starts to decrease. And remember, you need to know what your reinforcer is in order to withhold it. Some other things to consider is that for ethical reasons, in some cases, extinction may not be the best procedure to use. For example, if a behavior can't be ignored, or a behavior is extreme, self-destructive, or really self-injurious, or there are some medical conditions going on, extinction may not be the best thing to use in those situations. Now, here are a couple of reasons why an extinction procedure may not work. 1, the attention that you're withholding is not the reinforcer that was maintaining it. Remember the different functions. 2, the target behavior is receiving intermittent reinforcement from another source. Remember how we talked about everybody being consistent with the procedure? We need to make sure that if we put an extinction procedure in place, everyone's on board. So if mom and dad are never giving the child juice for screaming anymore, they're only giving the child juice for using the picture, but then a babysitter comes in and allows the child to scream for juice, the child is receiving intermittent reinforcement from another source. So the screaming in sometimes still works. And 3, the desired alternative behavior has not been strengthened appropriately. Let's look at a few different examples. If you're dealing with a challenging behavior that's maintained by the attention of others, now you may not be able to completely stop giving the child attention. However, try to withhold your attention immediately after the problem behavior. So look away, move away if possible, and if you can do so safely, and remain neutral. The other thing to remember is to reinforce those alternative, more appropriate behaviors, right? So if you're going to withhold your attention for screaming and tantrums, you want to be giving the child attention for when they're coming up to you, asking appropriately, when they're being quiet, and when they're doing those behaviors that you want to increase. Let's consider behavior that's motivated by escape. So let's say that you have a child who's engaging in some challenging behaviors in order to get out of a task. So for behavior maintained by negative reinforcement, removal of a task or escape, extinction means that the reinforcer is not allowed if the child engages in the problem behavior. So let's say you have a young child who engages in ripping of a paper or ripping of a spelling test, because when he does rip the paper, he doesn't have to write the test anymore. He's ripping that paper to escape the test. So in order to do extinction, we would follow through with the task, even if we have to provide some assistance to do so. So for example, this might look like taping the spelling test back together, or giving them another test, or helping them with a hand-over-hand prompt for them to do the spelling test. This way the child learns that they're going to have to do the test anyways, so the ripping doesn't work. With automatically reinforced behaviors, again, behaviors that occur because of physical sensations that a person gets, we might use something like sensory extinction, where we prevent or mask the physical sensation. Sometimes the challenge here is that it's difficult, or sometimes impossible, to identify what the automatic reinforcer is. So this can be difficult. Again, you want to use in combination with teaching an alternative response. Okay, let's have you think about a couple of examples. Let's say that a child engages in disruptive behavior of screaming in order to avoid the activity that he's being asked to complete. How would you use extinction here? Let's think first about what our function is. What's the reinforcer? Getting out of the task, right? Avoiding the task. So the function is avoidance, the reinforcer is avoidance, getting out of the task. So extinction would involve not letting the child get out of the task. So the screaming would not result in avoiding the activity. The child would have to complete the activity anyways. Here's another example. Let's say that a child runs around the classroom in order to get attention from his teacher or peers. What's the function? What's the reinforcer here? If you said attention, you're absolutely right. Getting attention from his peers or his teachers is the reinforcer. So we would withhold the attention. So when the child runs around the classroom, the teacher and the peers would not provide any attention. Withhold that attention, and we should see that running around behavior decrease. One last quick question. Which behavior would be more difficult to extinguish? A behavior that has been continuously reinforced, or a behavior that has been intermittently reinforced, meaning once in a while? If you answered B, a behavior that's been intermittently reinforced, you're bang on. Way to go. Think of slot machines in this example. Slot machines can cause really addictive behavior because an individual knows that not every time, but every now and then, the behavior of pulling that lever and putting money in will pay off for them. If a slot machine worked in a way where you put in money and it worked every time 10 times and then it completely stopped working forever, you wouldn't stay at that slot machine very much longer because you know it doesn't work anymore. The reason slot machines are so addictive is because you don't know when, but you know that at some point it's going to pay off. At some point you're going to get reinforced. So think of challenging behavior that way. This is why it's so important to be consistent. The child needs to know that that challenging behavior no longer works for them. And that's how extinction is going to be effective. Thank you.